"You're too old for me now." Those were the words my husband, Richard, used to detonate our 30-year marriage. He said them with a casual cruelty, leaning against the mahogany desk in his study, the picture of a man who thinks he's already won. He was expecting tears. He was expecting a fight, begging, maybe even a pathetic plea. He wasn't expecting the dead calm that settled over me. My name is Amelia Sterling. I'm 58 years old, and what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about the quiet woman standing behind the powerful man. To the outside world, to everyone in Washington, D.C., I was the perfect politician's wife. I hosted the flawless dinners, I chaired the right charities, and I smiled endlessly from the passenger seat of his polished life. Our Georgetown home was a stage, and I played my part perfectly. What they didn't know was that my family SE inheritance $4.5 million, to be exact, was the silent engine funding every campaign, every handshake, every single step of his climb up the political ladder. He got so used to the comfort of my money that he started to believe it was his. He saw me as an asset that had depreciated. But that night, when he delivered his final, heartless verdict, he made the biggest mistake of his life. He underestimated me. He thought he was closing a chapter, but he was really handing me the pen to write his ending. He had no idea that for the last 6 months, I hadn't been planning dinner parties. I had been planning his complete and total destruction. This is the story of how that happened. It's a long and painful road, and I'll need a friend to see it through. To be sure you hear how it all ends, you can follow the stories told here. That way, you won't miss the next part. For 30 years, our life had a rhythm, a comfortable, predictable cadence. I knew the sound of Richard's keys in the lock at precisely 6:15 p.m. I knew he liked his scotch with a single, large ice cube, and that he'd read the evening paper in the leather armchair by the fire, his feet propped up on the ottoman I'd needle-pointed for him in our 5th year of marriage. Our life was a carefully constructed symphony of routine, and I was its conductor. I thought that stability was a sign of strength, a testament to our enduring partnership. I now know it was just complacency. My complacency. The first note of discord in that symphony came 6 months ago, on a Tuesday. It was our 30th wedding anniversary. I'd spent the day preparing his favorite mealcock au vin, the same dish I'd made for him on our first anniversary, when we were young and living in a tiny walk-up with mismatched furniture and big dreams. I'd opened a bottle of the expensive French wine we'd been saving. The table was set with my mother's silver. The whole house smelled of rosemary and love. 6:15 came and went, then 7 o'clock. By 8:30, the food was getting cold, and a knot of anxiety was tightening in my stomach. It wasn't like him to be this late without calling. Not on a day like today. When he finally walked through the door, just after 10 p.m., the familiar sound of his keys felt wrong, alien. He didn't rush to me with apologies. He just stood in the entryway, shrugging off his coat, avoiding my eyes. He told me some story about a last-minute crisis with a donor, a political fire that only he could put out. He said he was so sorry that it had completely slipped his mind what day it was until he was on his way home. He tried to kiss my forehead, but his lips were cold and he smelled clean. Too clean. Like he'd showered somewhere else, and underneath the scent of soap, there was something else, a faint, sweet, floral perfume. It was a young scent, nothing like the classic Chanel I'd worn for decades. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. So I nodded, I tidied the ruined dinner, and I pretended that the jagged crack that had just appeared in the foundation of my life wasn't there. We went to bed in a silence that was louder than any argument we'd ever had. The next morning, as I was gathering his suit to take to the dry cleaners, my hand brushed against a small, stiff piece of paper in his coat pocket. My heart started to beat a little faster. I told myself not to look, to respect his privacy, the same way I had for 30 years. But I couldn't stop myself. My fingers, trembling slightly, pulled it out. It was a valet ticket. The first red flag should have been the name of the restaurant. La Toile, a trendy, ridiculously expensive place on the waterfront, known more for its romantic ambiance than its political backroom deals. It was nowhere near his office or any of the donor steakhouses he usually frequented. The second red flag was the time stamp. It was stamped at 7:05 p.m. and then again at 9:55 p.m. A nearly 3-hour dinner, a dinner that perfectly coincided with the political crisis he'd described. I stood there in our sun-drenched bedroom, the valet ticket feeling as heavy as a tombstone in my hand. It was such a small thing, a disposable piece of paper, but it was a lie, a deliberate, calculated lie. The perfume, the distance, the flimsy excuse, it all clicked into place. He hadn't forgotten our anniversary. He had chosen to spend it with someone else. The pain was sharp, a physical blow that took my breath away. But underneath the pain, something else was stirring. A cold, quiet clarity. He had looked me in the eye and lied. And if he could lie about this, what else was he lying about? That morning, holding that little piece of paper, I understood that the man I had spent my life with was a stranger, and the end of my innocence was the beginning of my suspicion. The week after I found the valet ticket was the longest week of my life. I was living in a fog of surreal calm, performing my duties as Mrs. Sterling with the precision of a robot. I smiled at the caterers. I approved the seating chart for the upcoming hospital fundraiser. I listened to Richard's self-important stories about his day on the city council. All the while, the valet ticket was tucked away in my jewelry box, a cold, hard piece of evidence that poisoned every interaction. Every time he touched my arm, my skin crawled. Every time he called me honey, the word felt like ash in my mouth. I was an actress in my own home, and the performance was draining me. I knew I couldn't live like that. Suspicion is a slow-acting poison. It corrodes you from the inside out. I needed the truth, all of it. Not just the validation of my gut feeling, but the facts, the who, the where, the for, how long. The thought of hiring a private investigator felt like something out of a cheap novel, a tawdry step I never imagined I'd take. But this was my life, and it was crumbling. I couldn't trust my own husband to give me the truth, so I had to buy it from a stranger. I didn't look for some burly ex-cop. I needed discretion. I needed someone who understood the delicate, interconnected world of Washington politics, where everyone knows everyone and secrets are currency. I remembered a name from a few years back, a man who had helped a friend of a friend navigate a messy public scandal. His name was Frank, an old-school investigative journalist who had been pushed out of the newspaper business and now worked as a discreet consultant. I bought a cheap burner phone from a 7-Eleven, my hands shaking so badly I could barely punch in the numbers. I called him from a bench in Lafayette Square, facing the White House, feeling the irony of it all. Frank's voice was calm, gravelly, and unimpressed. We met the next day in the dim, quiet halls of the National Portrait Gallery. Surrounded by the stoic faces of past presidents, I told him everything. I gave him the date on the valet ticket. I told him about the perfume. I didn't cry. My voice was steady, methodical. I simply said my husband is lying to me. I need to know why. I wrote him a check from a personal account Richard didn't know existed, an emergency fund my father had set up for me years ago. For a rainy day, he'd said. It felt like a hurricane was coming. Frank told me it would take a week. For 7 days, I barely slept. Every time the phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat. Every time Richard said he was working late, my imagination ran wild, painting scenarios that left me feeling sick and hollow. The waiting was a special kind of torture, a tightrope walk between hoping I was wrong and knowing, deep down, that I wasn't. On the 8th day, Frank called the burner phone. He said only 2 words, "It's done." We met again, this time on a different park bench. He didn't say much, just handed me a plain manila envelope. It felt heavy, heavier than its contents. I walked to my car, my legs unsteady, and didn't open it until I was locked inside my own garage, the engine off, the silence of the concrete space pressing in on me. My fingers trembled as I pulled out a stack of 8x10 glossy photographs. The first few were of Richard leaving his office building with a young woman. She was beautiful, of course. Young, vibrant, with long dark hair and a laugh that was visible even in a still photo. I recognized her instantly. Madison, his chief of staff, a girl I'd met at least a dozen times at political functions. A girl who had shaken my hand and told me how much she admired me. I flipped to the next photo. It was of them at an outdoor cafe. their heads close together, his hand covering hers on the table. It was intimate, too intimate. My breath hitched. I felt a wave of nausea. But it was the last photo that shattered me. It was taken at night, outside a small, elegant hotel in a part of town I'd never been to. He was kissing her. Not a gentle peck. It was a deep, passionate kiss, his hands tangled in her hair, her body pressed against his. He looked happy, alive, in a way I hadn't seen in years, staring at the face of the man I had given my life to. Intertwined with a woman young enough to be our daughter, a horrifying clarity washed over me. This wasn't a midlife crisis or a simple, sordid affair. This was a different person. The Richard I knew, the man I had built a legacy with, was a facade. He wasn't just a cheater, he was a masterful actor, and with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, I realized the man I had loved for 30 years might never have existed at all. For 2 days, the photographs lived on my nightstand, hidden under a book of poetry. I'd look at them when the house was empty, forcing myself to absorb every detail, the curve of Madison's smile, the possessive way Richard's hand rested on her back. The shock had worn off, leaving behind a hollow, echoing grief. It felt like mourning a death, except the person I was mourning was still sleeping in my bed every night, his breathing even and But as I studied the images, a new feeling began to surface, pushing through the sadness. It was a cold, sharp-edged logic. Richard was a politician. Every move he made was calculated. A man like him didn't risk a 30-year marriage and a stable public image for a simple fling. An affair was a liability, a potential scandal. Unless the affair wasn't the end game, unless it was a means to an end. A chilling thought took root in my mind. This wasn't just about sex or love. This was about my money, my inheritance, the silent foundation of his entire career. I picked up the burner phone again. This time, my hand was perfectly steady. When I spoke to Frank, my voice was different. The heartbroken wife was gone, replaced by a client with a clear objective. I told him the affair was just the surface. I instructed him to shift his focus from Richard's heart to his wallet. I wanted to know about any new financial advisors, any private meetings, any consultations with lawyers that were outside his usual circle. I told him to follow the money. I had a sickening feeling it would lead us to the real story. The second manila envelope arrived 4 days later, delivered by a discreet messenger to a private post office box I'd opened. This time, there were no photographs. It was just a thin sheaf of papers. I took them to the one place in the house that felt entirely my own. My small greenhouse in the back of the garden. Surrounded by the scent of earth and orchids, I sat down and began to read Frank's report. The first page was a summary of Richard's recent credit card statements. There were charges I hadn't seen before, hidden on a card I didn't know he had, jewelry from weekend trips to a luxury spa in Virginia, dinners at Chieli Toili, not just once, but 5 times in the last 2 months. He wasn't just having an affair, he was financing a whole separate life with Madison, using money that was legally half mine. But that wasn't even the worst part. The next section of the report made the blood drain from my face. Frank had discovered a series of meetings between Richard and a man named Marcus Thorne. I knew the name. Thorne was a divorce attorney, a shark with a reputation for leaving the spouses of wealthy public figures with nothing but their designer clothes and a mountain of legal fees. They hadn't met in an office. They'd met secretly at a private club. And then, the final page, the kill shot. Frank had managed to get his hands on an internal memo from Thorne's office. It was a preliminary legal strategy. My eyes scanned the cold, legalistic language, but the meaning was brutally clear. Richard was preparing to file for divorce, and he was going to argue that my entire $4.5 million family inheritance, held in a trust, had become a commingled marital asset. He was planning to sue me for half of it. The memo was chillingly specific. It detailed how he would use those funds, my father's funds, to launch his mayoral campaign the following year. It even mentioned Madison by name, outlining a PR strategy to introduce her to the public as his new, dynamic partner. He wasn't just planning to leave me, He was planning to publicly replace me, to install his 24-year-old mistress in my place, and to force me to pay for the privilege. The humiliation was the point. He wanted to strip me of my dignity, my security, and my name, all in one fell swoop, leaving me as a cautionary tale. The old wife, discarded and penniless. I sat there, in the quiet warmth of the greenhouse, the papers trembling in my hand. It was a well of betrayal so deep I couldn't see the bottom. This wasn't a man who had fallen out of love. This was a predator, a monster hiding behind a charming smile and a lifetime of shared memories. The grief I'd been feeling was instantly incinerated by a white-hot rage. He thought I was a fragile old flower he could simply prune and discard. He forgot that some flowers have thorns. In that moment, the tears I shed weren't for my lost marriage. They were for the fool he was about to discover he'd made of himself. He had started a war. He just didn't know I was already planning the final battle. Once you know the truth, you can never unknow it. The world looks the same, the people sound the same, but you are seeing everything through a different lens. My own home, once a sanctuary, now felt like an enemy stronghold. Richard was no longer my husband. He was my adversary. And I knew that to win the war he had started, I couldn't launch a frontal assault. I had to become a spy in my own life. The rage I felt was a roaring fire, but I learned to bank it, to keep the heat hidden deep inside where he couldn't see it. I needed him to believe I was the same oblivious, trusting Amelia he had so thoroughly misjudged. His arrogance was his greatest weakness, and I planned to use it against him. So I began to play the part of the perfect wife with a renewed, almost fanatical dedication. I suggested we host one of our big political dinner parties. It was the last thing on earth I wanted to do, to fill my home with people and pretend that my world wasn't a pile of ash at my feet. But it was the perfect stage for my performance. It would signal to him that everything was normal, that his little secret was safe. It would make him comfortable. It would make him careless. As I planned the menu and arranged the flowers, I felt a strange sense of detachment. Every task was a strategic move. The crisp white linens were my armor, the gleaming silverware, my weapons. When the night of the party arrived, I greeted our guests, senators, lobbyists, and their elegantly dressed wives with a smile that felt painted on my face. I moved through the crowded rooms, a gracious hostess on the outside, a cold, calculating general on the inside. I watched Richard work the room. He was in his element, charming and confident, accepting compliments on my beautiful home and my exquisite taste. At one point, I even saw him talking to Madison, who was there in her official capacity as his chief of staff. She had the audacity to approach me later by the bar, telling me how wonderful everything looked. I just smiled a tight, cold smile, and told her I was so glad she could make it. The effort it took not to throw my champagne in her face was monumental. The slip-up, when it came, was so subtle I almost missed it. It was late in the evening, after most of the guests had trickled out. Richard came up behind me in the kitchen, putting his hands on my shoulders. He was flushed with success from the party, his inhibitions lowered by a few glasses of expensive bourbon. He told me what a wonderful team we were, how he couldn't do any of this without me. It was all a lie, but he delivered it with such sincerity, I could see how he'd fooled so many people for so long. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about our future, about retirement. He said he felt our money wasn't working hard enough for us. He mentioned the stock portfolio, the one my father had set up, the one funded entirely by the Trustan. Said he thought it was too conservative. He told me he'd had a casual chat with a brilliant financial strategist from a firm called Sterling and Reed, who had some aggressive ideas for how to unlock its real potential. He was testing the waters, planting a seed. He wanted to see if I'd push back, if I'd be protective of my father's choices. He expected me to be the sentimental, financially naive wife. So that's who I became. I turned to him, feigning a look of thoughtful concern, and told him that he always knew best when it came to these things, and that if he thought it was a good idea, we should definitely explore it. I saw a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He thought he'd just cleared his first hurdle. He gave my shoulders a squeeze and walked out of the kitchen, whistling softly, completely satisfied with his own cleverness. As soon as he was gone, I leaned against the cold marble countertop, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with a sudden, ferocious joy. He had no idea what he had just done. He hadn't just revealed his intentions, he had given me a name, Sterling and Reed. He had confirmed he was actively attempting to manipulate the assets of the trust, a clear violation of the fiduciary agreement. He thought he was laying the groundwork for his heist. In reality, he had just handed me the blueprint to his own prosecution. The game was still on, but the odds had just shifted dramatically in my favor. The morning after the dinner party, the house felt different. The lingering scent of expensive perfume and cigar smoke couldn't mask the undercurrent of decay I now sensed in every room. But for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of power. Richard's careless whisper in the kitchen had been a declaration of his strategy. And in war, there is no greater gift than knowing your enemy's plan. I didn't waste a moment. At 9 o'clock sharp, from the burner phone, I made a call I should have made weeks ago. I called Mr. Chun, my family's lawyer since before I was born. He was a quiet, meticulous man who had helped my father build his real estate empire and, more importantly, protect it. His office was a time capsule of dark wood, leather-bound books, and integrity, the complete opposite of the soulless glass sand steel world of a shark like Marcus Thorne. I sat in the worn leather chair opposite his desk, the same chair I'd sat in 30 years ago to discuss the very trust Richard now planned to plunder. I laid everything out for him. I didn't editorialize or cry. I presented the facts with the cold precision of a military briefing. I told him about the valet ticket, the affair with Madison, and the secret credit cards. I pushed the manila envelope with Frank's photos across the desk, followed by the second envelope containing the legal memo from Thorne's office. And finally, I told him about Richard's slip-up, about his plan to move assets into a portfolio managed by Sterling and Reed. Mr. Chun listened without interruption, his fingertips steepled, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. He told me that my father had been a wise man, a man who believed in love but planned for human nature. He said that my father had worried about Richard's ambition from the very beginning. And then he told me it was time to visit the bank. An hour later, we were in the cold, sterile quiet of the bank vault. The air was still and smelled of metal and time. Mr. Sean produced a key, and the bank manager produced another. Together, they opened a safe deposit box I hadn't seen in 3 decades. Inside, nestled amongst some of my mother's jewelry and my father's old letters, was a thick, leather-bound folder. The original trust agreement. Back in his office, we spread the heavy, cream-colored pages across his desk. And there it was. On page 12, a clause my father had nicknamed the character clause. In dense, unforgiving legalese, it spelled out the conditions of the trust. It stipulated in no uncertain terms that the funds were for my sole benefit. More than that, it contained a specific addendum regarding infidelity and gross financial misconduct. My father, ever the pragmatist, had foreseen a situation just like this. But as Mr. Chun had his own people discreetly look into Sterling and Reed, Frank delivered one final report. He had dug deeper into Richard's finances, and what he found was the real motive, the pathetic, rotting core of the whole affair. Richard wasn't just ambitious. He was desperate. Frank had uncovered a series of disastrous private investments Richard had made over the last 5 years, losing a fortune on speculative tech stocks and bad real estate deals. He was deeply in debt, on the verge of personal bankruptcy. The mayoral campaign wasn't just a power grab. It was his Hail Mary pass. Winnie would give him access to new circles of wealth and influence, a way to quietly recoup his losses. Losing and having his financial ruin exposed would be the end of him. He needed my money not to build a new life, but to stop his own from completely imploding. Staring at the numbers on Frank's report, I felt a wave of disgust so profound it almost choked me. His grand betrayal, his passionate affair, his ruthless plan to destroy Mohit wasn't the act of a powerful man moving on. It was the desperate, cowardly scramble of a failure trying to save his own skin. He was going to burn down my entire life. Not for love or ambition, but to hide his own shame. He wasn't a king. He was a cornered rat, and my father, with his brilliant, cautious mind, had built the perfect trap for him 30 years ago. All I had to do now was wait for the right moment to spring it. Knowing Richard's true motivation, that he was a drowning man of his own, Micken changed the calculus of my response. My initial plan had been a quiet, swift legal strike. I would let the trust document do its work, bleed him dry in a lawyer's office, and watch him fade into obscurity. But that was before I understood the depth of his cruelty. He hadn't just wanted my money, he wanted to orchestrate my public ruin. He wanted the whole city to watch as he discarded me and crowned his new queen. A private victory was no longer enough. The punishment had to be as public as the crime he had intended to commit. My mind immediately went to the one place where our public and private lives converged most spectacularly, the annual Literacy for Life Gala. For 15 years, I had been the chairwoman. It was my baby, the crown jewel of my philanthropic work. And for 15 years, Richard had used it as his personal stage. It was the one night a year he could count on a captive audience of the city's most powerful and influential people, where he would give a charming speech, position himself as a dedicated public servant and devoted husband, and soak in the adoration. The irony was so perfect, so poetic, it was almost a gift. He had built his reputation in that ballroom, year after year. It was only fitting that he should see it dismantled in the very same spot. The gala was in 3 weeks. The timing was perfect. My first step was to take absolute control of the evening's agenda. I called a meeting with the event planning committee. I was a whirlwind of calm, focused energy. I reviewed every detail, from the floral arrangements to the wine pairings. When we got to the run-of show, I made my move. I told them I wanted to change things up this year. Traditionally, Richard spoke near the end of the night to rally last-minute donations. I suggested that this year, I wanted to close the evening myself. I framed it as a desire to give a special, heartfelt thank you to our most loyal donors, a more personal touch. No one questioned it. Why would they? I was Amelia Sterling, the ever-graceful, ever-liable chairwoman. They just nodded and made the change in the program. The next piece of the puzzle was technical. My plan required more than just words. It required visuals. Damning, irrefutable visuals. I needed to control the massive projection screens that flanked the stage. That meant I needed an ally on the inside. I thought of Leo, the young, bright AV technician from the event company we always used. I had always made a point to learn the names of the staff, to thank them personally. I'd seen Leo's face light up a few years ago when I remembered his name and asked about his mother, who had been ill. Small acts of kindness, I've learned, can be the most powerful investments. I arranged a technical walkthrough at the hotel ballroom, just me and Leo. I told him I was planning a surprise tribute as part of my closing speech, a short video montage. I handed him a small, encrypted USB drive. On it were high-resolution scans of everything: the Cartier receipts, the hotel bills, the damning photos Frank had taken, and a simplified graphic showing the flow of money from my family's trust to his mistress's lifestyle. I told him it was a highly confidential tribute to a surprise honoree and that it was critical no one else see it. I asked if he could cue it up to play on my signal-ass simple phrase I'd work into my speech. And now, I want to show you what true dedication really looks like. Leo, bless his heart, didn't blink. He just nodded seriously and said he would handle it personally. He assured me it would be ready to go, triggered only by my specific cue. He thought he was helping me honor a donor. He had no idea he was helping me detonate a bomb. Leaving the hotel that afternoon, I clutched my car keys in my pocket, my knuckles white. The pieces were now in place. I had the stage, the audience, and the weapon, all hidden in plain sight. Richard would walk into that gala expecting a night of triumph, another step on his path to the mayor's office. He would be smiling, confident, completely unaware that he was not the guest of honor, but the sacrifice. And I, his quiet, supportive, aging wife, would be the one to light the pyre. In the final week leading up to the gala, our house became a pressure cooker of unspoken truths. The air was thick with a tension only I could feel. Richard was more cheerful and affectionate than he'd been in years. He was high on the impending success of his plans, so sure of my ignorance that he moved with a breezy, careless confidence. He'd bring me coffee in the morning, telling me how much he was looking forward to our big night-each-kind orgy. Each casual touch felt like a deliberate taunt, a twist of the knife he didn't know I could feel. I accepted it all with a serene smile, my composure a mask of unbreakable porcelain. Inside, I was counting down the hours. I spent my days fine-tuning the final details of the trap. I had the stage and the weapon, but I needed to perfect the timing for maximum impact. I knew Richard. I knew his speeches. He would take the stage around 9:30 p.m. after the main course and the silent auction. He would be at his most charming, his most persuasive. He would talk about community, integrity, and the importance of family. He would probably even gesture to me in the front row, calling me his rock, his inspiration. The applause would be deafening. The donors would open their checkbooks, and his ego would be at its absolute zenith. That was the moment, the perfect moment. My presentation would not be an opening salvo, but a devastating counterstrike. The whiplash for the audience, from adoring him 1 minute to seeing the unvarnished truth the next, would be absolute. His fall wouldn't be a gentle slide, it would be a plunge from the highest possible point. With the strategy set, I added one final, crucial element to the plan. This was never just about revenge for me. It was about justice. It was about turning the ugliest chapter of my life into a force for good. I spent an afternoon visiting a small, underfunded shelter for women on the other side of town. It was a place for women who had fled abusive situations, many of them victims of the same kind of financial and emotional warfare Richard had planned for me. I spoke with the director, a tired but resilient woman named Sarah, who showed me their cramped quarters and explained how they had to turn women away every week for lack of space and funds. That day, I made a decision. I arranged with Mr. Chun to liquidate a portion of the stocks my father had left, my stocks held separately from the main trust. I wrote a check for an amount that would not only keep the shelter afloat but allow them to buy the building next door and triple their capacity. It was the single largest donation they had ever received. I told Sarah to keep it confidential for now, but to be watching the gala's live stream on Saturday night. I told her I was about to make a very public announcement. This act solidified my resolve. I wasn't just tearing Richard's world down. I was building a new one for women he would have gladly stepped over. The night before the gala, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark of my living room, the leather-bound trust document on the table in front of me like a sacred text. A wave of doubt, cold and sharp, washed over me. Could I really do this? Could I stand up in front of 1,000 people and obliterate the man I had once loved, the father of my now-grown children? I thought about our early years, the laughter, the shared dreams. A part of me mourned for that man, for the life I thought we had. Then I looked at the file next to the trust. Frank's photos, the cold, calculating legal memo. The betrayal wasn't a mistake. It was a conspiracy. My sadness hardened once more into a diamond-hard certainty. He had done this. He had made these choices. I was not the destroyer of our life. I was merely the person holding up the mirror to show him the monster he had become. As I dressed for the gala the next evening, I chose my gown with the care of a general choosing her armor. It wasn't a soft, forgiving pastel, but a sheath of deep emerald silk. It was elegant, severe, and powerful. As I fastened a string of my mother's pearls around my neck, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not a victim. Her eyes were clear, her expression resolute. Richard was expecting his smiling, supportive accessory to be waiting for him downstairs. He had no idea he was about to face a queen, ready to defend her own kingdom. Tonight wasn't just a party. It was a reckoning. Walking into the grand ballroom of the hotel felt like stepping onto a stage for the final act of a play I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. The flash bulbs of the press at the entrance were blinding, the air hummed with the sound of 1,000 conversations, and the scent of lilies and expensive perfume was almost suffocating. Richard was on my arm, his hand resting possessively on my waist, smiling his perfect politician's smile. We were the image of power and grace. To everyone in that room, we were the Sterlings, an institution. The performance had begun. For the first hour, I was on autopilot, gliding through the crowd, accepting compliments on the decor, and making small talk with people whose names I barely registered. My mind was a fortress of calm, my emotions locked away. My only focus was to observe. Richard, naturally, was holding court, surrounded by a circle of donors and city power brokers. And then I saw her. Madison made her entrance. She was wearing a crimson dress that was just a little too bold, a little too attention-grabbing for a chief of staff. She moved with the predatory grace of a woman who believes she is the future. She made her way to Richard's side, and he welcomed her into the circle, placing a hand on the small of her back. The perfect picture of the boss and his trusted protégé, but I could see what no one else could. I was across the room, pretending to be engrossed in a conversation about zoning laws, but my eyes were fixed on them. I watched as one of Richard's biggest potential mayoral donors, a construction magnate named Henderson, engaged him in a serious conversation. Madison, clearly eager to prove her worth, tried to jump in. She started to offer an opinion on a recent city council vote, her voice confident, and that's when I saw it, the crack in their perfect facade. It was almost invisible, but I knew Richard's tells better than I knew my own heartbeat. His smile didn't falter, but it tightened at the edges. A muscle in his jaw clenched for a fraction of a second. He subtly increased the pressure of his hand on her back, a gesture that looked like affection but was, I knew, a silent, forceful command. Stop talking. He then smoothly, expertly, talked right over her, seamlessly redirecting Henderson's attention back to himself with a charming anecdote. For a single, fleeting moment, Madison's mask of adoration slipped. I saw a flash of raw frustration and humiliation in her eyes before she could conceal it behind a brilliant smile. In that instant, I understood their entire dynamic. This wasn't a partnership of equals. He didn't see her as his future first lady. He saw her as a beautiful, silent accessory, and she, in her youthful ambition, was already chafing under the constraints of that role. Their alliance wasn't built on love. It was a fragile, transactional arrangement built on his narcissism and her ambition. It was destined to crumble. And I felt a final, liberating surge of power, knowing I was about to be the one to kick it over. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I ate without tasting, smiled without feeling. I was in a state of hyper-awareness, every sense heightened. I could hear the clinking of forks on china, see the light glinting off 1,000 champagne glasses. Across the vast room, I caught the eye of Leo at the tech station. He gave me a single, imperceptible nod. The bomb was armed and ready. Finally, the moment arrived. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the podium. And now, he boomed. A man who needs no introduction, our city's finest public servant and a true champion for this cause, Richard Sterling. The room erupted in thunderous applause. Richard stood up, buttoned his tuxedo jacket, and leaned down to kiss my cheek. He whispered in my ear, his voice full of triumphant confidence, "Here we go, honey, our night." He walked toward the stage, bathed in the warm, adoring glow of the spotlight, looking every bit the conquering hero. He thought he was about to give the speech that would launch the next phase of his life. He had no idea it was the last speech he would ever give as a respected man. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. The storm was here, and I was ready to direct the lightning. Richard took the stage to a standing ovation. He stood at the podium, basking in the adoration, a master of his universe. He was brilliant. I had to give him that. He spoke with a passion that felt genuine, his voice ringing with conviction. He talked about building a city on the foundations of trust, about the sacred duty of public service, and the importance of family as the bedrock of a strong community. I watched him, my hands folded calmly in my lap, a silent observer at my own husband's public self. Then came the moment I knew was coming. He paused, his expression softening, and looked directly at me in the front row. He told the audience he couldn't do any of his work without the unwavering support of his incredible wife of 30 years. He called me his anchor, his inspiration, his one true partner. The room filled with a chorus of AWS, and a wave of applause was directed at me. I met his gaze from across the room and gave him a small, serene smile. He saw it as the familiar look of wifely pride. He had no idea it was a goodbye. When he returned to the table, his eyes were shining with triumph. He squeezed my hand, his skin warm, his confidence absolute. A few minutes later, the MC returned to the podium. And now, to offer her closing remarks and a final thank you. Please give a warm welcome to the heart and soul of this event, our incredible chairwoman, Amelia Sterling. The applause was warm and respectful as I made my way to the stage. The walk felt both infinitely long and incredibly short. The heat of the spotlights was intense, but I felt a preternatural calm settle over me. I looked out at the sea of fascista, most powerful people in the city, all of them witnesses. Richard was beaming from his seat, a proud husband. I began my speech by thanking everyone for their generosity, my voice even and clear. I spoke of the foundation's work, of the children we had helped. Then, I shifted gears. I told them that the spirit of giving had inspired me to make a special, personal contribution. I spoke about the vital importance of providing a safe haven for the most vulnerable in our community, especially women seeking to rebuild their lives after facing betrayal and hardship. I then announced my $1 million personal donation to the Downtown Women's Shelter. The room exploded into a cacophony of gasps and thunderous applause. It was an astonishing sum, and the announcement had caught everyone, including Richard, completely off guard. He was on his feet, clapping the loudest, his face a mask of pride. He thought I had just made him look good. I let the applause die down, holding up a hand. "Thank you," I said, my voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in. This donation was inspired by a recent, very personal education in the nature of deceit and financial abuse. A confused murmur rippled through the room. Richard's smile faltered. I looked toward the back of the room and made eye contact with Leo. I took a steadying breath and spoke the trigger phrase into the microphone. "And now, I want to show you what true dedication really looks like." The massive screens on either side of me, which had been displaying the Gallus logo, flickered to black. The silence in the ballroom was instantaneous. Then, they blinked on, displaying not a Tribio video, but a crisp, clear image of a receipt from Cartier. The murmuring started again. I used my calm, clear voice to narrate. "This is a receipt for a $30,000 diamond tennis bracelet, charged to a joint account last April. A birthday gift, I presume. Though my birthday is in November." The screen changed. A series of hotel and spa bills appeared, detailing luxurious weekend getaways I had never taken. Richard was no longer looking at me. He was staring at the screens, his face and where does a busy public servant find the time for so many relaxing retreats? I asked rhetorically. The screen changed again. This time, it was a photograph. Richard and Madison, laughing intimately at a cafe. Gasps echoed through the hall. Madison, sitting at a staff table near the back, looked like she had seen a ghost. I let the image hang there for a moment. As you can see, my husband has been very dedicated, not to his family, but to his chief of staff, Ms. Madison Crowe. Then came the final image, the Kilshachi, the 20-foot high-resolution photograph of Richard and Madison locked in a passionate kiss outside the hotel. The room fell into a state of absolute, profound shock. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. With the image of their embrace looming over the silent crowd, I delivered the final blows. My voice was devoid of emotion, a simple recitation of facts. For the last 6 months, my husband has not only been engaged in this affair, he has been conspiring with lawyers to divorce me, sue me for my entire family inheritance, and use my money to fund his mayoral campaign, with Ms. Crowe at his side. The plan was to leave me, a 58-year-old woman, publicly humiliated and financially destitute. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle into the horrifying silence. He told me recently that I was, in his words, too old for him now. He seems to have forgotten that with age comes a certain wisdom, and a deep appreciation for the fine print. I glanced down at Richard. He was a statue, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and horror. He was completely and utterly broken in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. "Thank you all for your support of Literacy for Life," I said, my voice ringing in the stillness. "Good night." I turned and walked off the stage. No one clapped. No one spoke. There was only the sound of my own footsteps and the deafening, soul-crushing silence of 1,000 people staring at the ruins of a man who, just 5 minutes earlier, had thought he was king of the world. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. As soon as I stepped off that stage, I walked straight through the back of the ballroom, past the stunned kitchen staff, and out into the cool night air. I didn't look back. I didn't. The deafening silence I left behind was more explosive than any shouting match could ever be. I got into my car, and as I pulled away from the hotel, I saw the first few guests stumbling out onto the curb, their faces pale with shock, already on their phones, spreading the story like wildfire. I drove home not with a feeling of glee or triumph, but with a profound and heavy sense of finality. The war was over. The aftermath was a media tsunami, just as I'd expected. The story was on every news channel, the front page of every paper. Gallagate, they called it. Richard's public and political immolation was swift and total. His donors vanished overnight. The party elders, who had been grooming him for the mayor's office, disavowed him in a scathing public statement. His carefully constructed world had been built on a foundation of my money and his reputation. In a single evening, I had taken both away from him. Frank's final report on his disastrous investments became public knowledge, and he was forced to declare bankruptcy within a month. Madison disappeared from the face of the earth. Her political ambitions had been hitched to Richard's star, and when it went supernova, she was consumed in the blast. I heard through the grapevine she moved back to her hometown, a pariah in the city where she had so desperately wanted to reign. Their great love affair, it turned out, couldn't survive the sudden death of their financial and political prospects. The divorce was quiet and brutally efficient. Armed with the character clause from my father's trust and the mountain of public evidence, Mr. Chun dismantled Richard's legal team. He didn't get a single penny of my inheritance. He didn't get the house, the cars, or the art collection. He walked away with nothing but his personal belongings and the public shame that would follow him for the rest of his life. The first thing I did after the divorce was final was put the Georgetown house on the market. It was a beautiful house, but it wasn't a home anymore. It was a museum of a life that had been a lie. I walked through the empty rooms one last time, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the space that had once been filled with laughter and political chatter. I felt no sadness, only the lightness of letting go, with the profits from the sale and the full, undisputed control of my inheritance. I fulfilled the promise I had made to myself on that stage. I didn't just donate to the women's shelter. I created the Phoenix Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal aid, financial counseling, and career coaching to women over 50 who are rebuilding their lives after divorce. The shelter I'd helped was our first major partner, and this is where the final twist of my story happened, the one I never saw coming. I thought that my victory, my ultimate satisfaction, would be in watching Richard's downfall. For a while, it was, but the satisfaction of revenge is a cold, hollow meal. The true healing, the profound joy, came from something else entirely. It came from sitting across a table from a 62-year-old woman named Eleanor, whose husband of 40 years had left her with a mountain of debt, and being able to tell her, "We've got you. We're going to fight for you." It came from seeing the flicker of hope return to her eyes. Destroying Richard's life didn't fix mine. Building a new one, a life with a purpose that was entirely my own, did. I had to forgive myself for the 30 years of willful blindness, for choosing to see only the man I wanted him to be. The revenge was a necessary fire to clear the land, but the real work was planting the new garden. Richard learned the hard way that my age was never my weakness. It was the source of a resilience he could never comprehend. My story, in the end, isn't just about getting even. It's about getting whole again. It's about the quiet, unshakable strength you find when you have nothing left to lose. A strength I know is shared by women everywhere, in cities all over the world. It makes me wonder, where are you listening to this from? Let me know in the comments which city you're in. It's a comfort to know we're not alone.